the U.S.-Mexico border is often imagined as this place where you have single Mexican men who are crossing over into the United States to work. And I think actually a lot of Americans also don't understand that that's no longer the case, and has been the case now for quite a while. In 2014, we hit the first year in which the number of people who were apprehended at the border who were not Mexican exceeded the number of people who were Mexican apprehended at the border. And that trend has just continued since 2014. And mostly because of the growth in people from three countries, the Northern Triangle countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. These three countries are creating so many migrants and asylum seekers for a complex of reasons, but a major one is that people are fleeing for their lives because they are threatened by gang violence, domestic violence, state violence, from which they are not protected by state security forces. Human Rights Watch actually earlier this year released a report in which we identified or investigated 138 cases of Salvadorans who have been killed since 2013 after being deported from the US. And those people who were deported in many cases were killed by the same actors who threatened them and caused them to flee. And that those actors often are two, in particular, street gangs, the Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, and the Barrio 18, the two gangs who have sort of fought for territory in the countries of the Northern Triangle, and in particular in El Salvador. We also see people, number of people who are fleeing because of their LGBT identity and who are subject to violence in those countries, and then of course along the migration route because of that identity, and who have sought asylum in the US, and who upon deportation, as we document in this report from earlier this year, also can face harm and in some cases death. So this is a true refugee situation, one in which the UNHCR, the Global Refugee Agency, has been engaged. It's a mixed flow of people. There are people whose lives, the threat to their lives probably doesn't rise to the threshold that would require refugee protection. There's a pre-existing context here of prior refugee flows, in particular from El Salvador and from all three countries. But when you think about El Salvador, that went through a horrendous civil war that caused hundreds of thousands to flee. That's created, a deeply rooted Salvadoran community in the United States, and so you have family ties that are motivating people moving back and forth as well. And that's also true for Guatemala and Honduras, in that there's large numbers of Guatemalans and Hondurans and people of Guatemalan and Honduran descent in the United States who are connected to communities in those countries. And so it's not surprising that there would also be migrant flows on the basis of those connections. But they're certainly not the only nationalities represented. You have Haitians who have crisscrossed countries across Central America to make it to the border. You have people from Russia, China, Romania, India. There's an increasingly used migration route that goes even through South America, up through the entire body of Central America, through the very dangerous Darien Gap in Panama. People from who are fleeing ethnic violence in Cameroon are often taking that route, as well as people from many other places in Africa. So it's not at all, I mean, it's an incredibly diverse mix of asylum seekers, people who are making, as you know, a really difficult decision to flee their country, and are at in some ways, what they often believe to be the end of these incredibly difficult journeys that have lasted for months before they arrive. The Trump administration has been working since the very beginning of its time in power to cut off the right to seek asylum at the US-Mexico border. That is, as Trump has said himself, to return every single person who comes across the border to seek protection in the United States. And that pre-COVID was a war that they were in some ways winning, I will have to say. There were two sort of major initiatives that were making it incredibly difficult for anyone to get a fair shake at protection in the United States. One of them is called the Migrant Protection Protocols. And that initiative returned to Mexico, mostly Spanish speakers, to wait as they were scheduled for court hearings in the United States. And that had applied already to tens of thousands of people who were living in oftentimes in very squalid conditions, in very dangerous border towns, waiting for months or even years to go through a process in the United States in which they really had no access to due process. They couldn't very easily access attorneys. They often found it difficult to even show up at the port of entry, where they would need to present themselves to go to court, because the towns in which, on the Mexican side, to which they were being returned, were so dangerous that they risked their lives even sort of circulating in those towns. And so that program, which started ramping up last year, began in January of 2019, and then ramped up across the border throughout the year, was a major step backward in the right to seek asylum in the United States. Adding to that, over the last year as well, over 2019 as well, were the rollouts of the asylum cooperative agreements that the Trump administration signed with several countries in Central America. And, in some ways, these are modeled after European policy initiatives to return people who are not from those countries, but who are seeking asylum in the US to theoretically seek asylum in a different country, or find safety in a different country. I say theoretically because there's pretty good evidence that, in fact, they're just being returned to harm and essentially deported or removed without any process in the United States. These asylum cooperative agreements were and are sweeping up people who are in the same boat as those who are being put into the migrant protection protocols, the program that I just described. But they are also but they have no right, once they're in the asylum cooperative agreement, once they're in the return to Central America programs, they have no right to pursue asylum in the United States. They're being sent back, in this case, to Guatemala, and theoretically in Guatemala given a chance to apply for asylum. But what we found is that that's really just not possible in the context of the Guatemalan asylum system. And most people, because they have no place to live in Guatemala, often Hondurans or Salvadorans, are just basically forced to return to where they originally fled, because they have nevertheless more social connections there in most cases. So those two programs, along with truly hundreds of other ways in which the administration has tweaked the asylum system legally to make it more difficult to gain protection, really meant that I think as advocates we were feeling like we were losing the battle to really protect people's rights at the border. What COVID has done is that is now very clear. We have lost. There is the right to seek asylum in the United States is non-existent. And that's because the administration has used the specter of disease and the idea that there's, in my view, the specious idea that there's a public health reason to deny asylum seekers access to US territory, to return people to Mexico within a period of about 90 minutes on average, with no process in the United States. And that has applied to tens of thousands of asylum seekers and migrants who have crossed into the United States since March, when the policy was rolled out. Will the US be able to recover in terms of its compliance with international law and in terms of its compliance with refugee protections? I think a lot of us here are asking ourselves that. Some of the domestic organizations, no fault of their own, because there is a lot going on in the United States, that you would expect to be able to take this policy, the so-called public health policy, to court, or overwhelmed. I can't comment on why exactly no suit has been filed, but the difficulties of operating for civil society in the post-COVID context seem to be part of it. So it's not yet under challenge in US courts. And so we don't know whether the courts would save us, essentially, whether the courts would bring back refugee protection in the United States. And there's a history, actually a hundreds of years long history of using disease to restrict migration. That goes back in the US to a terrible time in the 1880s, for example, when there was the exclusion of Chinese people from the United States. That was justified by an outbreak of the bubonic plague here in San Francisco. And we can get into this because I know this is sort of where you want to go. We're obviously facing an election in November. It's pretty clear to me that the Trump administration will fight to retain its order ending asylum on the so-called basis of public health, as long as it's in power. The question would be, one, will the courts be able to push back on that while Trump is still in power? And then two, what can we expect out of a Democratic or a Democrat Party president and or one or both houses of Congress? And what can we expect them to do about asylum on the border? I think we have a long way to go to ensure that even a Biden presidency would do the right thing in terms of human rights and refugee protections. And I'm saying that as someone who's worked on these issues now in the United States for about 20 years. And we are quick to forget in some ways that the both parties in the United States have basically had desires to restrict migration, to not give asylum seekers their fair shot at gaining protection, to shut down the border, to wall or fence the border. These are sort of long-standing initiatives that go back in their current iteration, let's say, to the mid-90s under the Clinton administration, right? They connect, in this case, migrants with disease, but they also, in the public discourse, often connect migrants or immigrants with crime. And the Obama administration, as is, I think, well known, deported more people than any previous administration. And that sort of mass churn of deportations, and together with the massive detention complex that goes along with it, is, I think, unique in the world to the United States. But the political impulses that would make it difficult, I think, for a Democratic president to fully roll back the damage that's been done by the Trump administration, or perhaps not, or perhaps that's seen around the world. And those are really, I guess, a lack of desire to foreground migrants' rights in the context in which we're living, a lack of desire to take politically risky decisions or decisions that might create an opening for criticism from the moderate middle that both parties are trying to, or particularly the Democrats, I think, are trying to persuade. And so although there's, I think, larger and larger constituencies of people in the United States who are standing up for migrants' rights, standing up for, in particular, in the last several years, you've seen mass mobilizations about the rights of unaccompanied children in the United States, and a real, I think, new realization that these things are human rights issues. But the political polarization that we're seeing has the Democrats trying to corral a large tent, while the Republicans are trying to corral a smaller tent of motivated, very right-wing supporters. And that's been a winning strategy for them in the 2016 election. Whereas the Democrats are trying to appeal to people with, I think, objectively a broader range of political views, including political views that aren't as friendly to human rights. The ways in which the Republican Party is responding to the mobilizations around police violence, in that instead of pushing back and continuing on a rhetoric as Trump has done around immigrants, which is very hard, they're attempting to sort of sweep it in to their policy standpoints. The Senate Republicans are preparing a police bill. It sounds as if it will have really quite milquetoast proposals, but they are proposing. They're talking about police violence as something that needs to be addressed. President Trump has, in a very ham-handed way, talked about George Floyd as someone who was wronged by the state, and so it's interesting that they feel, apparently, the Trump administration and the GOP feel more threatened by that mobilization and that level of concern throughout a huge number of constituencies than they do about those who are mobilizing for the rights of migrants. If you look at the rise of the Republican Party over the past decade or so, or 15 years, that's been driven by a political strategy that focused on localities, that focused on building up the power of the Republican Party in school boards and city councils and state houses. The United States has an incredible amount of government. We have so many thousands of elected officials at every different level of government that was actually an incredibly effective strategy to build power and to gain power over the Congress nationwide. And so the question of, we take very seriously as human rights organizations that are working in the United States, what do we need to be doing at local levels, at the state level? And I'm in California, and I've been involved in our state capital in Sacramento for the past several years. I have to say, there is a lot that we can be doing, and what we have done to protect the rights of all Californians. One of the highlights in the past couple of years is that we pushed for and got passed and signed into law a complete phase out of the use of private detention companies here in the state, both in the criminal justice system and in the immigration detention system. That's being challenged in court by the Trump administration, of course, and also by the private companies themselves. But we're fighting that, and then we're fighting it at the local level, where we're having to push each county that's affected, that has these private prisons, to comply with the law that the state has now passed. If you had copycat states picking that up around the country, the Trump administration's war on deeply rooted migrants who have homes, communities, family here in the United States would become impossible, because they wouldn't have the detention space in order to sort of to detain the thousands that they are arresting and attempting to deport. But there's lots of other things too that states can be doing, and we're seeing that actually in terms of the COVID response. States like California are stepping in, where not the Trump administration, but the Trump administration and Congress has left out the millions of undocumented residents of the United States who are also feeling the economic harms of the pandemic from relief bills. States are stepping into that void, because they know that having a strong community and economy requires including people without documents in relief programs. So that's an incredibly important strategy here in the United States, and it's one that I think we've at Human Rights Watch have explored, but one that we will have to continue to explore regardless of what happens in the national elections. So your question and the way that you framed up, the concerns around the national elections, I think is really perceptive and really important. One of the things that's terrified me around the migrant protection protocols and these tens of thousands of people who have been returned to Mexico and who theoretically have immigration court proceedings in the U.S., even though often they can't get to them, or they're otherwise prevented from getting a fair treatment in them because of lack of access to lawyers. These tens of thousands of people who are now backed up on the border. It will take a politically brave act to say these people have been harmed and they all need to be let in now, because there will be constituencies who will raise hell, honestly, about the idea that you would let in tens of thousands of people all at once. We're taking an Angela Merkel style of bravery to say, no, we're going to do this. And it's not at all clear that Joe Biden has that kind of political bravery, because the sort of minimum thing that I think, I'm sort of ascribing thoughts and strategies to them, but I think the minimal thing that the Democrats now think that they can do is simply be not Trump. And if they say that they're stopping that program, they're not going to, continue the Trump administration policies, then they may be able to satisfy people who are less engaged, and who are looking less closely at what's actually happening. Any sort of change administration is going to have to both stop the Trump administration policies, but also look really carefully at redress and at ensuring that the people who have been harmed by the Trump administration policies, and also the policies that come before it, have an avenue to remedy and that remedy may be being allowed into the U.S. While they go through their asylum proceedings. In the cases of separated families, that remedy may be a mass program to make sure that everybody is compensated for the emotional and physical harm that program created. And there may be a number of other different creative ideas for how to remedy the kinds of harms that the system is creating. One of the things that has developed over the Trump administration is an initial real confidence that the courts were going to save us. The courts were going to save the United States' commitment to these legal norms, to refugee protection, to fair treatment of migrants, to the fair and humane treatment of children even. I think there was sort of a clear emphasis among US social movements to support legal challenges and to believe that legal challenges were really going to be the way in which the Trump administration's agenda could be checked. And that idea that courts will save us has now been revealed as wrong in the context of the United States. The courts are no longer going to be able, in my view, going forward to protect those norms for a variety of reasons. One is because the Trump administration, although it's incompetent in many things, one of the things it's been really good at is getting judges through the confirmation process, and has basically changed the makeup of the federal court system. Now, even in the sort of most progressive areas of federal courts out here in California, just recently became a majority of Trump appointees who are sitting on the benches. And then you sort of add that to the current makeup of the Supreme Court. As we saw at the end of the Obama administration, the Republican Party pushed in a kind of unprecedented way not to allow President Obama to nominate a Supreme Court justice in the last 10 months of his administration. And that aggressive maneuver has paid off because now the Supreme Court is pretty clearly sort of in the hands of Republican and conservative appointees, and is pretty clearly, to be honest, no longer a neutral part of government. It's pretty clearly just another partisan branch of government, and a branch that the Republican Party has controlled and is now and could control for quite a while. So that I think that thinking even more broadly than the context of immigrant rights in the U.S., the sort of bald partisanship of the court system is something that U.S. democracy is going to have to reckon with over the next couple of years.